In the first half of this session, we discussed the United Kingdom and the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon. Now we'll discuss the divided kingdom. This starts in 1 Kings chapter 12, and it'll be in page 18 of your workbook. I have here the timeline, and once again, as you see this timeline, realize that on page 76 of your workbook, you can see the things that are written here a lot more clearly than you can here. I realize these are little words that can't be read. You probably wouldn't be able to make those out. So look at page 76 to get a better view of that. Notice what happened after Solomon's death. Here we have Saul, David, and Solomon, and after his death, the nation of Israel split into two nations. The northern kingdom, made up of 10 tribes of Israel, and so here we have the northern kingdom and the different kings that ruled in the northern kingdom. There was also the southern kingdom of Judah, and you can see the list of kings that ruled there. And so this divided kingdom goes from 1 Kings chapter 12 through 2 Kings. King Jeroboam of the northern kingdom rebelled against King Rehoboam of the southern kingdom. And so we have this split. 1 Kings 12, starting in chapter 12 through the end of 1 Kings, the primary character that we see there is Elijah. He comes into the picture in chapter 17. And in chapter 18, we have the well-known story of Elijah on Mount Carmel, where he defeats the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. Elijah is known as the prophet of truth. Remember that truth is absolute. It can be viewed as harsh or as hard by some people. And that is how we sometimes view Elijah, as we see him here slaying a prophet of Baal. When we go on to 2 Kings, chapters 1 through 25, the person that takes Elijah's place is Elisha. Whereas Elijah was a prophet of truth, Elisha was known as the prophet of grace. His ministry was more compassionate. In chapter 4 of 2 Kings, he provided a widow with oil, and the Shunammite's son was raised. And just as Jesus multiplied the fish and the loaves, he fed 100 people by multiplying loaves in chapter 4. 2 Kings chapter 5, Elisha heals Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army. And in chapter 6, a man had borrowed an axe head from a neighbor, but he lost it into a pool of water, and Elisha raised the axe head, made it float so that he could recover that axe head. Looking at the timeline, we see that at the end of this period of time, in 2 Kings chapter 17, it talks about the defeat of the nation of Israel by Assyria. The northern kingdom came to an end at that point. And as we go to the end of 2 Kings in chapter 25, we see the defeat of the nation, the southern kingdom of Judah. They are defeated by Babylon. And that brings 1 and 2 Kings to a close. Now we'll go to 1 and 2 Chronicles. Here shows the defeat of Israel and the defeat of Judah. In 1 and 2 Chronicles, I'll just mention first that 1 and 2 Kings were written by Jeremiah, who wrote about the kings of both Judah and Israel. He wrote about all of them. But when we come to 1 and 2 Chronicles, realize that this was written years later by Ezra, who was a priest. And he only had a concern for the spiritual foundation of Israel, of the nation. And so he wrote about the same time period as 1 and 2 Kings, except that he wrote exclusively about the kings of Judah. Jeremiah wrote about both the northern and southern kingdom. Ezra wrote only about the southern kingdom, where Jerusalem and the temple were located. In 1st and 2nd Chronicles, in the first 9 chapters of 1st Chronicles, Ezra begins a genealogy of the nation of Israel, going clear back to Adam. After this genealogy, then he starts with the United Kingdom. In chapter 10, it talks about the reign of King Saul and the death of Saul. Going on, past King Saul to King David's reign, that completes 1st Chronicles through chapter 29, talking about David's reign as the king. It's interesting to note, though, that David's adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah is not mentioned in 1st Chronicles. Now, that is a pretty important part of Jeremiah's writings in 1st and 2nd Kings, or I should say in 2nd Samuel. He is, it makes a big deal of David's killing of Uriah after his adultery with Bathsheba. Why would Ezra not mention that at all? Did he want to just cover up something bad that had happened? Was he trying to put just a positive spin on David's reign? Even though that could be the case, I think something that makes more sense is that God, it shows his forgiveness of the things that we do. David did something that was very bad, but yet he repented, and God forgave him and forgot that he did that. Once we repent, God throws that away, and we never have to worry, dredge it up again. We don't need to dwell on it. Maybe that is why Ezra doesn't mention David's sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, because it was a sin that he committed like we all commit, and yet it was forgiven and forgotten. Well, going on to 2nd Chronicles. The first 9 chapters talk about the reign of King Solomon. And this is where we have our memory verse for today, 2nd Chronicles, chapter 7, verse 14. If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin and heal their land. I hope you memorized that verse. It's a good verse, a pretty popular memory verse. One I have for the next session, session 3, is Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. And so I urge you to memorize that for next time. Now we'll go on to the divided kingdom. In chapters 10 through 35, we read about, again, the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom. And then in chapter 36, we read about the fall of the southern kingdom of Judah and of Jerusalem. This brings us to the timeline once again. And notice where this arrow is pointing at this black line here. The northern and the southern kingdoms have been defeated. The kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, all those in Jerusalem, they were deported or transported to Babylon for a 70-year period. This was what was prophesied by Jeremiah, that they would be in captivity for 70 years as punishment for their idolatry. And so at this point, we're going to stop and not go to the events that happened after the captivity. To make this as chronological as possible, this study, what we're going to do now to finish out this session today is talk about the wisdom literature that is largely attributed to David and to Solomon. And so in case you're wondering, in your workbook, in page 18, you see 2nd Chronicles. We will not mention here Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. We'll cover that next time in the next session. We're going to jump right to the wisdom literature on page 19 of your workbook. And so let's go to the wisdom literature. we're going to see that the wisdom literature discusses the joys and the sorrows of being human. And the first book that we'll talk about is the book of Job. Job deals with the cry of the human heart, our spirit struggling to trust God when everything in life is crumbling around us. When we get to the Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, this deals with the cry of the human soul, where Psalms deals with the soul's emotions. Proverbs deals with the human soul's will, and Ecclesiastes deals with the human soul's mind. Solomon deals with the cry of the human body. Do you remember the tabernacle from Exodus that Moses built? The heart, soul, and body are closely associated with the tabernacle and later the temple. We can see that here with the brazen altar where the animal sacrifices were made. That has to do with our body. It depicts our body, and it's what's discussed in the Song of Solomon. When we get to the holy place, we see that here we have the table of showbread. The holy place reminds us of our soul, and the table of showbread reminds us of our emotions, our desire for fellowship. And this is reflected in the Psalms. The lampstand represents our intellect or our mind, and this is discussed in Ecclesiastes. And then the golden altar represents our choice, our will, the decisions that we make. And we can read about these, making wise decisions, in the book of Proverbs. The Holy of Holies, that deals with our heart and our spirit. And we'll see about that in the book of Job. Two more interesting points I'd like to make about the tabernacle before we leave this is that this is a visual reminder of the first and greatest commandment, that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our strength. Also, with this picture of the tabernacle and the way the furniture is arranged, you can see that one Bible scholar mentioned that it depicts the cross. Just something to think about. So let's go on then to Job. The theme of Job, the cry of the human heart. It's all about suffering. It emphasizes that the heart or spirit is struggling to trust God when things go wrong. And so the first question that we see associated quite often with Job is, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? And the answer to that? Senseless suffering arises as a result of Satan's continual challenge to the government of God. If man had never sinned, would bad things happen? Well, no, of course not. All suffering is a result, directly or indirectly, of the fall, of our poor choices, individually as well as corporately. In other words, we reap what we sow, just as we saw in the life of King David. God doesn't cause suffering, but He allows it, and He causes good to come from it. That's one of the reasons that Romans 8:28 is such an important verse for me, that all things work together for good to those who love God, who are called according to His purposes. I've had physical things happen through cancer, through companies I've worked for that have declared bankruptcy. I know what it's like to be in turmoil when things aren't going the way that you would like them to go. But I have found that this verse has worked for me throughout my life, that all things work together for good to those who love Him. So, let's continue now with Job, the cry of the human heart, and look at Job's sufferings and the losses in chapters 1 through 3. Job is wealthy, but Satan attacks him and he loses everything. In chapters 4 through 37, Job is dialoguing with his friends. Why did these things happen? All friends agree that Job is afflicted because he has committed a terrible sin. But Job knows that isn't true, and so he is frustrated and he is angry. And he questions God, but he never totally pushes God away. In chapters 38 through 42, Job is dialoguing now with God. God replies to Job out of a whirlwind, confronting Job with his greatness and with Job's smallness. The book of Job is written in a certain literary style that builds symmetrically around a central theme. I'll show you this on the screen, but you can also see it in your workbook on page 73. We see here that at the symmetrical aspects of this, we see Job's circumstances in chapter 1. We see Job's circumstances at the end, that he was rich in chapter 1, but he was even richer at the end of chapter 42. Next, we see God and Satan who are dialoguing with each other. But at the end, we have God and Job that are dialoguing with each other. Here we have Job's friends giving the speeches, and then the fourth person, Elihu, later speaking, telling Job that it's his fault. But Job then protests his innocence in chapters 27 and chapters 29 through 31. And that brings us to the central theme of Job, and that is to be wise. Where does wisdom come from? It can't be bought. So where does it come from? These questions you can see as you read through the 28th chapter of Job. In verse 28 of that chapter, we are told that wisdom comes from fearing or having a reverent respect for God. That is wisdom. And as we turn from evil, that is understanding. And so submitting to God and obeying Him are the keys to understanding and dealing with our circumstances. The message of Job, that God allows but does not cause bad things to happen. We must trust that good will come from it and that He will be with us in the midst of those trials. Job learned this lesson and was blessed. Now, on to the Psalms and the Proverbs. These are generally two of the most loved books in the Bible. Psalms because it speaks to us on an emotional level, and Proverbs because of the wise advice that it contains. Psalms, the cry of the human soul's emotions. And so the main theme of Psalms is emotions. The different Psalms address discouragement, thankfulness, joy, guilt, shame, confession, forgiveness, fear, doubt, loneliness, worry, anger, bitterness, praise. There are 16 messianic psalms that deal directly or relate directly to the Messiah, Jesus. The best known probably is the 22nd Psalm that begins, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" A picture of Jesus on the cross there in Psalms 22 through 24. Next, I'd like to show you a little bit about the structure of the Psalms. I imagine most Bibles are divided into, the Psalms divided into 5 different books. Maybe you've noticed that before. And each of these 5 books ends with a doxology of praise to God. And these 5 books also, the 5 books within Psalms, parallel the first 5 books of the Bible in the law. And so let's look at these now. In Book 1, this is Psalm 1 through Psalm 41. And it relates to Genesis, which deals with creation. In the 8th Psalm, verse 3 and 4, when I observe the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars which you set in place, what is man that you remember him? The Son of Man that you look after him. In Book 2, Psalms 42 through 72, we see a picture here of the Exodus, of deliverance and redemption. Psalm 46, verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, a helper who is always found in times of trouble. Book 3, Psalm 73, going through Psalm 89. This speaks of the book of Leviticus and of worshiping God, how to approach God. In Psalm 84, verse 2, I long and yearn for the courts of the Lord. My heart and flesh cry out for the living God. And then, in the fourth book, Psalm 90 through 106, here we have a section that relates to numbers and the desert wanderings that we often go through, the ups and downs of life. In Psalm 90, verse 10, our lives last 70 years if we are strong, 80 years. But even the best of them are struggle and sorrow. And then going on to the fifth book, Psalms 107 through 150. This is a reflection back upon the book of Deuteronomy and God's Word. In Psalm 119, verse 105, Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, a light unto my path. And to sum up the Psalms, Book 1 tells us that God created us, but we rebelled and we are in need. In Book 2, He redeemed us. Therefore, in Book 3, we worship Him. Book 4, even though we worship God and have that relationship, we still fall away. And so in Book 5, by dwelling in His Word, we can grow closer to Him, maturing in the faith. That brings us to the Proverbs. The cry of the human soul's will. Proverbs deals with wisdom, and it deals with our will, our decision making. It encourages us to make wise choices. Our lives are almost totally determined by the choices we make. Job was wisdom, as I mentioned earlier, but in a dialogue form between Job and his friends. Proverbs is also all about wisdom, but it's in a monologue form, as Solomon gives out these proverbs of wisdom. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7 is almost identical to the central theme of Job in chapter 28, verse 28. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Proverbs are a puzzle, and they must be meditated on in order to fully be appreciated, to realize their benefit. Proverbs is probably about the most difficult book to outline. There are many topics in Proverbs: adultery and lust, alcohol, anger, patience, counseling, a number of verses on finances. And it's rather difficult sometimes because financial advice, for example, is spread out throughout about 12 or so of the chapters in Proverbs. And so there are some that have collected a topical approach to Proverbs that seems to make maybe a little bit more sense. If you're wondering about financial advice, you can just look for those verses that are just about finances and so forth. But the way it's written, it just kind of jumps from one to the other for some reason. In chapter 1 through 9, we talk about the importance of wisdom. Chapters 10 through 29, the Proverbs of Solomon, various Proverbs that he gave out. Chapter 30, the words of Agur, which is thought to be another name for Solomon. And then in the last chapter, Proverbs 31, it starts off with the words of Lemuel, which some scholars have said that that's Bathsheba's name for Samuel. And then starting in verse 10, it goes on to the description of an excellent or a capable wife. Who can find a capable or excellent wife? That completes Proverbs, and now we'll go to Ecclesiastes, the cry of the human mind. The theme of Ecclesiastes is emptiness. It deals with the cry of the human mind, the intellect, trying to find meaning and purpose in life. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2. Everything is meaningless if we try to find meaning apart from God. Ecclesiastes describes many different philosophies of life, which I'm only going to cover very briefly here. There are more details of each of these chapters and these different philosophies in the homework assignment. So just looking at these very briefly, in chapter 1, we see that we are just a small cog in a godless universe. This chapter speaks of a mechanical or an impersonal view of the universe. In chapter 2, the emptiness of the pursuit of pleasure. In chapter 3, it talks about having no hope, and so just live for the moment. Do what feels good right now. Chapter 4 talks about economic oppression, that work is futile. Chapter 5 begins by discussing dry and impersonal religion. Going on then through chapter 6 to materialism, showing that riches and possessions don't satisfy us. In chapter 7, it speaks of calloused indifference. It seems that the righteous perish, but the wicked thrive, and it makes no sense. And so we just have to accept what happens with a calloused indifference. Going to chapter 8 through 11, it gives us a common sense view of how to live life, considering what we've just talked about in the previous chapters. We are to obey our superiors, obey our bosses, enjoy your life, enjoy the time with your wife, and don't do anything foolish. It mentions these common sense approaches with the term under the sun during our life here on earth. Just live in a common sense way. And when we get to chapter 12, the final chapter, we see a shift in the viewpoint. Chapter 12, verse 1 talks about a creator, someone greater than us, and that our whole duty in verse 13 is to fear God and keep His commands. And why is that? Because in the last verse of Ecclesiastes, we are told that there will be a judgment. And so it's not just about this life. Well, let's go on then to the Song of Solomon, our last book for today. The theme of the Song of Solomon is the bride. It deals with the cry of the human body for love. There are various interpretations of this. Some view it as an allegory having a deep, hidden meaning. Some refer to it as just being literal, the relationship between Solomon and his bride. And then some look at it in a symbolic way, symbolically representing Christ and His relationship with His bride, the church. And so I'll mainly just dwell on these last two interpretations, the literal and the symbolic view. And again, as I go through these chapters, you'll notice that they are again symmetrical in the style, just like Job was, pointing to a central theme or a central point. In chapters 1 and 2, we have the courtship of Solomon and his bride. Or, if it's symbolic of Christ and the church, it's where we start to learn about God. In chapter 3, we have the marriage of Solomon and his bride, or for the Christian, drawing closer to God. In chapter 4, we have the marriage is consummated. And as far as the symbolic view of this, it's where we become one with God, where we make that connection and we are born again. In chapter 5, the honeymoon is over. The love that they had cools. And for us, in the symbolic way, our love for God tends to cool as well sometimes. We tend to fall away from God. That leads then to them making up, Solomon and his wife. And for us, that means repentance, repenting for what we did and turning back to God. And at that point, the marriage of Solomon and his wife will deepen as their love matures. At this point also, in the symbolic sense, it's talking about our love growing between us and Christ as we mature in the faith. And so the truths to draw from Solomon, that true love is to be exclusive, staying attracted to only one person. True love means being faithful and leads to sex only in marriage. And true love preserves romance in marriage. Well, that brings this lesson to a close. Next week, in the next session, it will be session 3. We will finish the Old Testament. And so I would urge you to memorize all the books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Malachi. The memory verse is Jeremiah 29, verse 11. And the homework for this next session, the prophets, starts on page 21.